The podcast episode with Alex O'Connor and Joe Folley opens by examining the evolution of philosophy from ancient to modern times, highlighting a shift in how the discipline is perceived and practiced. Originally, philosophy was deeply interlinked across multiple domains: metaphysics, logic, ethics, epistemology, and was inherently practical. Ancient philosophers, especially figures like Aristotle and the Stoics, did not sharply differentiate between these branches, instead seeing them as interconnected paths toward answering vital questions about how to live a good life. For instance, Stoicism's ethical teachings derive directly from its metaphysics and logic, where understanding the universe's rational nature was central to practicing virtue. The guests argue that modern philosophy tends to be more departmentalized and abstract, with distinct fields such as epistemology, ethics, logic, and philosophy of language. There is a suggestion that contemporary philosophy sometimes fragments into intellectual exercises disconnected from practical living. Yet, both agree that philosophy remains inherently practical at its best, especially when it addresses questions about knowledge and ethics. The ancient emphasis on living well and achieving eudaimonia serves as a reminder that philosophy was never meant to be mere intellectual showmanship, but a guide to living meaningfully. A poignant reflection follows on how philosophy's progress, or lack thereof, compares with that of science. Unlike physics or biology, which cumulatively build on established knowledge, philosophy often cycles through similar questions across generations without definitive resolution. This cyclical nature invites skepticism about philosophy's utility, likening it to intellectual masturbation rather than tangible progress. The guests contend that many philosophical inquiries restart afresh with each generation, given that philosophical questions are often contingent on worldview commitments rather than cumulative empirical discoveries. Moreover, the discussion touches on the fragmenting of philosophy's foundation, especially in ethics, when it is stripped from metaphysical groundwork. Without a metaphysical anchor, ethical theories risk becoming personal preferences or emotional vibes. Ancient schools grounded their moral philosophy in metaphysical claims about the universe's nature, a unity lost in many modern ethical approaches. This loss contributes to ethical debates seeming stalemates and the difficulty of conceptual progress in philosophy today. Stoicism prominently features as a subject of contemporary cultural fascination, noted for its emphasis on endurance and emotional resilience. The guests dissect how modern interpretations often sanitize or simplify ancient Stoic teachings, neglecting their metaphysical and theological foundations. Stoics believed in a universe governed by divine providence, a rational and purposeful cosmos in which acceptance of fate was a rational response. This theological underpinning is often omitted in present-day discourse, presenting Stoicism as a purely pragmatic method for emotional control. The wider cultural appeal of Stoicism is attributed partly to its reputation as a philosophy offering consolation amid existential uncertainty and personal suffering. However, the guests warn against divorcing Stoicism's ethical practices from its original metaphysical commitments, as this risks losing philosophical depth. The dilution of Stoic logic in later Roman Stoics, such as Epictetus, illustrates an internal historical precedent for this kind of simplification. The guests suggest revisiting these dimensions to enrich modern understanding rather than accepting truncated versions. Aristotle's philosophy, especially his Nicomachean Ethics, emerges as a vital resource for practical philosophy that modernity has perhaps undervalued. The guests highlight Aristotle's realistic approach to ethics, noting his recognition that virtue alone cannot guarantee a flourishing life without some baseline physical and social goods. Aristotle's concept of the golden mean, where virtues lie between extremes of excess and deficiency, is praised for its enduring practical utility. Especially celebrated is Aristotle's theory of friendship, where he distinguishes friendships of utility and pleasure from friendships of virtue. The latter, characterized by mutual moral improvement and loyal commitment, is seen as foundational to living well. The guests lament modern culture's diminished emphasis on friendship, with romantic and individualistic frameworks overshadowing the communal and ethical centrality Aristotle ascribed to friends. They propose that revitalizing Aristotle's vision of friendship could counteract contemporary social atomization and foster human flourishing. Turning to more existential themes, the guests openly explore nihilism and philosophies often associated with pessimism and despair. Nihilism is clarified as the belief in the lack of inherent purpose or meaning, which does not necessarily predicate a depressive or tragic outlook. Instead, one can both acknowledge nihilism's core and choose to live well within its framework. The guests encourage trying on such philosophies temporarily to understand their influence personally. Philosophers like Emotivism are noted for articulating a brand of pessimism that blends dark humor and acute suffering insight. The humorous aspect of extreme pessimism, where absurdity arises from relentless misfortune, is identified as a mechanism for existential coping. In contrast, the oft-cited myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus comes under scrutiny for its arguably insufficient solution to absurdity. Imagining Sisyphus happy seems to some both counterintuitive and incomplete. The discussion points to Camus's later works, which wrestle with these tensions, underscoring philosophical development rather than static conclusions. Anti-Natalism, particularly through David Benatar's work, provides a rigorous, if bleak, ethical stance, arguing against procreation due to inevitable suffering. Benatar's asymmetry argument that the absence of pain is good even if no pleasure results, while the absence of pleasure is not bad unless accompanied by pain, challenges conventional moral thinking about birth and existence. This radical view frames existence itself as morally problematic, reinforcing the dark undercurrent in some contemporary philosophical discussions. While compelling in its logical rigor, Benatar's position raises difficult questions about suicide and the meaning of continued existence. His analogy that life is akin to watching a bad movie halfway through captures the paradox of enduring life despite regrets about having been born. The guests acknowledge that while this philosophical argument fascinates, its practical reception remains limited due to human emotional and social complexity surrounding life and death. An extensive portion of the dialogue addresses the philosophy of mind, situated as one of the most promising and challenging areas of philosophy. The guests emphasize the mysteriousness of consciousness as both an empirical and metaphysical problem. One proposed solution gaining traction is panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe, present even at the most basic levels of matter. Panpsychism offers an alternative to dualism and reductive materialism by positing that mind and matter are not separate but profoundly intertwined. The combination problem, a major challenge to panpsychism, explores how individual conscious experiences combine into unified subjective awareness. Fascinating real-world phenomena, like split-brain patients, illustrate the complexity and fragmented nature of consciousness, complicating simplistic unity assumptions. The guests suggest that advances in neuroscience, particularly interdisciplinary work, are vital for philosophical progress in understanding consciousness. Delving into meta-ethics, the conversation turns to emotivism, a theory positing that moral language expresses emotional attitudes rather than objective truths. According to emotivism, statements like "murder is wrong" are not factual claims, but emotional expressions akin to saying "boo murder." This perspective challenges traditional views on morality's objectivity and shifts the focus toward understanding ethical disagreements as clashes of emotional expression rather than truth claims. Nonetheless, the guests clarify that emotivism does not imply moral anarchy or arbitrariness. Social and evolutionary pressures can constrain what emotions arise, fostering broad consensus. The complexity of moral discourse is illustrated by distinctions between factual disagreements and emotional judgments. Even deeply entrenched moral intuitions, such as incest taboos, are argued to be rooted more in emotional reactions, just gross, than reasoned foundations. The theory prompts reconsideration of ethics as a domain interwoven with human psychology and social dynamics. Given their roles as conduits of philosophical ideas to a wider audience, Alex and Joe reflect on the ethical responsibilities involved in this form of influence. They stress the importance of humility, transparency, and admission of fallibility when communicating complex and nuanced topics. Presenting philosophy as a starting point for personal exploration rather than dogmatic truths is essential to fostering thoughtful engagement rather than rote consumption. They acknowledge the risks inherent in media, where philosophical content is packaged for entertainment or rapid consumption. Misrepresentations or oversimplifications can mislead audiences, with potentially harmful consequences, especially around sensitive topics such as suicide or existential despair. The sense of duty includes avoiding intellectual arrogance and recognizing the diverse impacts their content can have on individuals' lives, underscoring the seriousness of philosophical influence in public discourse. A recurring theme concerns the temporal and contextual evolution of philosophical ideas and their originators. The guests emphasize that many philosophers' views develop significantly over their lifetimes, shaped by personal experiences and historical circumstances. Understanding this evolution prevents naive or anachronistic readings of texts and encourages seeing philosophy as a dynamic human endeavor. They also stress the importance of historical context, including political pressures and social conditions impacting what philosophers could write and publish. For example, censorship or personal misfortunes influenced figures like Dostoevsky, reminding listeners that philosophy is embedded in lived realities. Recognizing these factors enriches interpretation and highlights the necessity of approaching philosophical works with both curiosity and critical awareness.